Welcome to Why I Quit, a show that covers real people quitting their 9-to-5 jobs in search of something different. Listen to inspiring conversations where we dive deep into the stories of why people quit their jobs, what were the hardest parts, where are they now, and any advice for people following the same path. I am so excited to introduce Gerson Martinez as this week's guest on Why I Quit. Listen to Gerson discuss his experiences of being raised in rural Maryland by his parents who immigrated from El Salvador. Learn how he achieved his lifelong dreams of getting a job on Wall Street and why he quit to find his purpose. Get inspired hearing about his journey to help create a more financially inclusive and equitable society. Hey, Gerson, thank you so much for joining me today. It's a pleasure to have you.
Thanks very much. Thanks for the opportunity. I'm grateful that you called.
Can you go back and tell me a little bit about your upbringing?
Yeah, absolutely. So, my name's Gerson Martinez. I was born and raised in this town that I'm in right now in rural Maryland. I am the son of two Salvadoran immigrants to the United States. They emigrated here probably 40 years ago, close to 40 years ago, for a lot of the very common reasons that a Central American might emigrate at that time. There was a civil war going on in their country, and it was a matter of fleeing towards safety. So I had a really, I think, unique experience, or interesting and unique experience on a lot of different levels as a kid. Number one, just being, the son of immigrants in rural America made me like one of one at my school. I was the only kind of Spanish-speaking kid at my school. And also my parents, by the time I was born, they had decided to be small business owners. So I never saw my parents go to a 9-to-5 job, right? And ask for vacation time or all the stuff that's traditional, work culture stuff. They never did. I saw the other side of it, the grind, the absolute grind, but then also the kind of freedom and the flexibility that comes with it, right? So I got this kind of unique and interesting vantage point as a kid. I can definitely say I didn't fully appreciate until, my adulthood and, where I am today and what I value.
With that upbringing, your parents being small business owners, where did that put your head as you are going to school and thinking about what your career wanted to be?
As a very, low-resourced people, and my parents, by the way, my dad has a 6th grade education, and my mom went to college, but she went to seminary. She thought she would be a missionary her whole life. They're folks of very, meager means. They come from, very poor homes in Central America, and so my parents' aspiration for me, their goals for me, distilled simply, my dad was like, if you can work in an air-conditioned building with a computer in front of you, you've already won. That was as simple a goal as he could see, right? And in his view, he's like, work with your brain, not with your hands like I have to, right? That was his kind of aspiration for me. So coming out of high school and going into college, and I should say they had high expectations of me academically. They were like, we're working our butts off so that you don't have to, therefore your job is school, right? So there's very high expectations around academic achievement. So college was we can't help you figure out applications and that kind of thing, but it's on you to try your hardest. We're going to make sure that you can go. So I would say that my drivers, at the time, my motivations were simply that, to achieve financial goals. And I don't mean to say excess, right? It's not about excess. It was about achieving that aspiration that my dad had for me, which was, let me just make sure that I can reach that kind of stable income, that predictable paycheck every 2 weeks that my mom and my dad never had because they're small business owners. Along the way, I had a few examples around me of professionals, very few, right? Because I come from a working class, not highly, college educated, family kind of thing. So I thought maybe I want to be an engineer. I tended to be pretty good at math. So I thought I might go into the engineering space, but I ended up studying math and economics, which was another set of topics that really interested me. I had the chance to go to College Park, the University of Maryland at College Park.
And so as you are going from college into your first job, you've mentioned that you didn't have those expectations of people around you that had typical corporate jobs. So what was your experience in terms of your first role, and what was that like for you?
I have to say I was very, very fortunate super blessed, really, call it what you want to call it, right? All of the things seemed to coalesce to kind of propel me into what I would call the absolute like unicorn dream job that I ended up desiring at that time. Along the way, I developed a keen interest in capital market. I wanted to work within the financial industry in some capacity. So I had the opportunity to intern for a person who, in the 80s was really a really successful bond trader. I didn't know what that was at the time, but it was really enthralling to me, right? Like this guy who was sitting in Maryland, but was intimately knowledgeable about what was happening at the financial center of the world in New York. His, I think, advice and mentorship over the course of 2 years was instrumental. Without Mike Damus in my life, I wouldn't have then dared to apply at some of the jobs that I applied for, like the Federal Reserve Bank of New York. I applied there, I applied at every, major investment bank. And I did land a job at Morgan Stanley. So I took my first job in February of 2008 as the lowest level, administrative assistant. But importantly, I had wedged my foot in the door of a major investment bank. Now, this was happening at a time where the world was about to fall apart in that industry. But honestly, I was too young and too naive to understand really the magnitude of what was happening at the time. I would say I managed to survive. I managed to just kind of survive by no merit of my own because people were, at the time there was a financial crisis and people were getting fired left and right. But I achieved that thing that my dad said, air-conditioned room with a computer in front of me. And it just so happened that it was exactly the industry, exactly the seat, I guess, that as a college student, I dreamt of. So it's really hard to kind of put into words how much I overshot, expectations in that first job. And I say it utterly blindly, right? It wasn't like, oh, I have this master plan to get to that particular seat. It was just like luck on top of blessing on top of right place at the right time kind of thing. I don't consider myself any smarter or better or anything than anyone else, right? We're just a product of work, but also a lot of circumstance, right? I was at Morgan Stanley for 5 years, and I'm really, really grateful for that time because it's a really unforgiving environment. There are 100 other very, very smart people who want your job. So if you don't show up and give 200%, someone else will. I think that's kind of where I cut my teeth, right? It really taught me that nothing's going to be given to me, right? And someone's always willing to eat your lunch if you're going to lay back and take it easy. Someone else will come and get what otherwise you could have, acquired. And as a 22-year-old, up until that point in my life, that was the aspiration. That was as far as my imagination could take me. That's all I want. This super exciting trading desk job at the peak of American capitalism, right? It sounds silly to say, honestly, but at 22 years old, that was kind of the dream.
Are you just so excited about this opportunity that you're all in and just, loving every moment of it? Or was it also not what you expected and more difficult than you thought as well?
I would say both. So quick anecdote, actually. In my first 2 weeks of work, very non-glamorous, I would spend 10, 11, 12 hours a day at a desk, taking orders from people and doing meaningless things. And then 2 weeks went by, Monday through Friday, then weekend, then Monday through Friday. And I was it dawned on me around that time. I was I have to do some version of this for the next 40 years of my life. There was the first red flag in my professional life about wait a minute. I had never seen that 9 to 5 ever, right? I had seen my parents execute their vision, but I had never seen them clock in, clock out. So it was exciting to kind of arrive and be a part of this industry. And I will say over the years, I was oh my God, things were really unreal, right? The type of people that I got to meet, places that I got to see, and rooms that I got to sit in, and information and all that kind of thing. Those were all very exciting things for a 22, 23-year-old. I truly believe, we can plan all we want, until life really does throw you a curveball and things start to change. And I would say that within the first 2 years of my experience at Morgan Stanley, my life started to change. And it was primarily, I would say at this juncture, it was due to just meeting the girl who would become my wife. I met my wife, Samantha, just as I was moving to New York. We dated at a distance for 2 years. She lived in Chicago. I lived in New York. And we got married. She moved to New York. I'm still working at this bank and things are going well professionally, right? But that means I'm working harder and I'm a newlywed and I spend like zero time with Sam. I'm at the office before the sun rises, home after the sun is down. We hang out at like dinner time and then I got to do it again. 5 days a week. It was suddenly I'm like, this is not the life that I want, And frankly, and I could, because I used to work on this trading desk where there's like no walls between you and like 50 other people per row, right? And so I could physically look down at my boss's boss's boss and be like, do I want to be the desk head in like 20 years? And I started to see that, no, I didn't. I'm sure the guy's paycheck is gigantic, but do I want his life? Like, he travels every 2 weeks. He's on his third wife. He's constantly angry. I don't think I want that, So I started to think in like long term, what am I doing here? How long am I going to do this and to what end? If I don't want that life, then what am I doing here? And what's my plan? What then do I do if I don't want that 20 years from now? So I think that's the question that started to rattle around in my head. And I do have to admit, it took me a full 2 years from the time that I said I asked Samantha, I said, would you be okay with me leaving the industry? I don't want to do this. You know that you don't want me to do this. I don't want to do this. However, I'm not a brain surgeon or a lawyer. On a deep personal level, forget the material stuff, but like, would we be okay with a smaller income trajectory? And the answer was yes, unequivocally. Like, if we get the life that we want, time with each other, which is what life is, right? It's just your time, how you spend it. If we get our time back in exchange for a paycheck, absolutely. But that was probably 2011 when we decided that together. And it wasn't until 2013 that I had the guts to leave what was otherwise a golden opportunity, right? For me, remember, kid of immigrants. How do you tell your dad that you quit, a Wall Street job? It was a very tough decision to like at the gut level to make. In 2013, January 17th, if I'm not mistaken, I made the decision to leave. I asked my employer to add me to what's called a reduction in force. It's very savage industry. There's like a day of the year where it's like firing day, and the following day is bonus day. So like they fire who they don't want to pay a bonus the next day to. So I asked to be added to that reduction in force, and I left. And I had absolutely no idea what I was going to do. I had absolutely no clue. I simply knew that I couldn't do that, but this is where also, like, as a kid with that piece of paper, that bachelor's of science degree, right? You knew you're employable. You're employable. You know that someone will hire you somewhere to do something, right? And now you have some experience on your resume. So I knew I would be okay because of that piece of paper, thanks to my parents who put me through college. But I had no idea. I just knew how long I could like survive without income for a bit in New York. I would also say that in that time, another really important catalyst that's important not to leave out of the story was 1 month before I actually quit. My grandfather, who was 94 years old, lived a super healthy, fantastic life. Married for like 70 years. I had known him for the last like 25 years of his life, but he was 94. So when we buried him, I met in El Salvador, I met scores of people 50, 60-year-olds who would come up to me and say, you have absolutely no idea the impact that man had on me 50 years ago, 60 years ago, right? He was a pastor his whole life. And I was all of 25, 26, but I was like, if I were to die tomorrow, will I have made an impact on anyone's life? And the answer was unequivocally no. Other than, like, my wife would be sad, my parents would be sad, but everybody else, like, I would have made no impact on the world. I think that was kind of like the last straw that allowed me to say, okay, I don't know what's next, but it can't be this.
What was it that really led to that 2-year time frame from when you decided, like, okay, I'm going to do this until you actually pulled the trigger?
Honestly, just nerves. From the time I was 19, pretty much my entire college existence, all that energy exerted studying and trying to excel in school was for this. And then I got this, And then I'm like walking away from it. It was really hard to reconcile within myself. It's like, are you insane? So it was a 2-year reconciliation process of like, do you really want to do this? Are you absolutely sure? And what comes next? And when the answer is you don't know, it's a really hard decision to make. So finally, the catalysts were, number one, personally, like I said, my grandfather, I think, event had a really deep impact on me, right? Questioning myself, like, what's my value to the rest of the world? And not really having a satisfactory answer to that was one. But then on a practical level, it was also preparing, right? It took 2 years of really being absolutely certain of two things. Number one, do we have enough savings, or how much savings do I have to be able to like float to whatever is next? And then also being pragmatic. I described to you the way in which I left. I didn't like bust into my, I understood the processes that I could, the options that I had to coast out of my job rather than like cut the cord and not have any paycheck. The way that I decided to do this was, like I said, adding myself to a reduction in force. And what that does is it allows you to get severance pay because somebody up in the ivory tower decided that 10% of the workforce is going to be let go. And so it's already budgeted, right? That X amount of people are going to be let go, and they budget for your severance pay. The thing is, they had picked somebody else on our team, and I was slightly younger than that person, and I was going to kind of be promoted to that person's position, but I didn't want to be there, right? So it's like, what do I want the promotion if I don't want to be my boss's boss's boss, right? I knew that this was all going to happen. I had a really, really good relationship with that guy whose life that I didn't want. And so I went, to Dario and said, I just want you to know that I would like to be added to the RIF if that's a possibility. Huge risk, because they could have said, okay, leave today. You're not part of the RIF. You can leave today. Thankfully, my boss was I think saw the sincerity in what I was doing, right? Wished me well. We had lunch, afterward, the following week once we could talk. It's not like like rainbows and unicorns, like follow your passion aimlessly. You have to be pragmatic too. Like you have to be practical. I should caveat this by saying that my professional job was to be a derivatives trader. I am not a risk-averse person, relatively speaking. I like to take calculated risks.
So many times when people are quitting their job, a lot of times they're talking about that conversation that they're having with their boss and the impact that it's going to have on them. And like, I love how you brought up, the specific conversation you had with your significant other. And so talk to me a little bit about, was that a tough conversation to have? Were you guys on the same page? And what did that look like?
Thankfully, it was not a hard conversation to have. And I can actually trace it back. So we used to live on the Upper West Side in New York for those years that that I was at Morgan Stanley. And I remember we didn't have kids at the time, young, recently married. My wife also comes from an immigrant household, raised by two immigrants, one from Mexico, one from El Salvador. She was the first in her family to go to college, that kind of stuff. So we had already won, right? In the eyes of our parents, we had already won this game. We were going to be okay, right? We're both employable in America. And so that was kind of the basis of the conversation, to say, I dreamed of going to Paris for a small trip to Paris, just the two of us, before we had kids. And that was as limited as my imagination was at the time, right? It's like, look, if we can go to Paris one day, just two of us, spend like a couple of days there, come back, we'll have the pictures and the video forever. And we can rest. If we never get to go again, we can be content that we did, right? And so we did that, and as small and symbolic as that was, but it was like, okay, we've had that experience, right? And now we can discuss cutting the cord and not, with this job. And so at a personal level, it wasn't a debate like, oh, what are we going to do? No, it was like, we're going to trust this feeling that we have that I shouldn't be in this job that's going to pull me away from my wife and my kids forever. So it was a really relatively easy conversation. I would also say that it was a function of being young. We were 23, 20, whatever, 4, when we started having this conversation. I think it's much harder to have when you have a lot of assets and a lot of liabilities and relationships and clients and stuff you've worked really hard for like a decade. We'd worked for a handful of years. I think it was easy for that reason as well.
And now the conversation with your parents, how did that go when you officially quit?
Oh my God, that was much harder, right? That was like, and I should say my parents became very, very supportive of the decision. And the reason is because my parents simply want me to be happy, right? they didn't know that I wasn't happy, right? Because we didn't talk every day. They're in Maryland, I'm in New York, and they were like, "Oh no, our kid, we're so proud of him. He's living the dream." They didn't realize that I wasn't really living the dream. Perhaps I was in the work environment that they aspired for me to be in, but they didn't realize just how, like, where my head was at. So when I started to describe those things, of course, they asked all the probing questions that a, hardworking entrepreneurial couple would. But then they said, "We trust you, like you need to be happy. There is more to life than a paycheck." Right. And I think my grandfather thing, that conversation, when I said, "Guys, I realize my life is not of impact to anyone. I've never even thought about other people. I've only ever thought about myself." And as gross as that sounds, that was just true. I was just like laser focused on like me and my career and my whatever dreams, They ended up being very understanding and supportive. And it's never come up like, "Oh, should you have?" I mean, they're like, what do you think? Like, what would your life be like if you hadn't left? I'm like, I could tell you what it could be like because I have a bunch of friends that are stuck there, right?
Yeah, and now, I'm curious to kind of hear how the story goes in terms of, what are the next steps? Obviously, you make the leap and you don't know what's next. Walk me through the process of how did you figure out what was next? Again,
I think chance has a lot to play here, and a willingness. Again, I'm a risk tolerant person, right? So I think my choices, I tend to say yes to things first before I say no. And I know that comes with risk of failure, of disappointment, but I choose to live my life kind of with that, lens. I thought at the time, I was like, there's so much I want to explore about the world. I want to go to every coffee shop in New York and take pictures. I like photography. And I didn't even get a chance to start doing this, just hobby type stuff that I wanted to explore when Sam and I were approached by a person that we knew personally in New York who had just been selected as the head of school for something called a charter school, which I'd never heard the term before. I knew nothing about education, but my wife is a teacher. And so really he was approaching her and saying, "I was just selected to be a head of school for a brand new charter school. I want you to be one of my teachers. I need 14 teachers and I need your teacher number one. You're the first person I'm approaching to hire." And Sam was elated. And, she 100%, she's like all in. By the way, we had this whole time in New York, we had only been living on my income because my wife was a recent college graduate. And then the guy, his name is Aaron, approaches me and he says, "Listen, I know," because we know him personally, he knew that this was going on. He's like, "I don't know what you're up to next. I don't know what you want to do, but if you're interested," turns out that, charter schools are nonprofit organizations. Not that I knew how to run a school, but I knew how to speak the language of finance, put a budget together and that kind of thing. So he's like, "If you're willing and if you'd like to work with your wife, there's a job here for you." So I was hired to be the director of finance and analytics for a startup charter school. And I can't tell you how much of a 180 degrees turn that was professionally, because January 2013, I am working on a trading floor at headquarters of one of the world's biggest investment banks. And a month later, I am volunteering, because I wasn't hired yet, but I was volunteering to pass around like leaflets about a non-existent charter school that was going to launch on the corner in the South Bronx, the poorest school district in the country. So I'm like walking around a neighborhood that I'm not from. I've never been in. I'm not expressing regret. It was just like shell shock. Like, oh my God, like I made this gigantic shift, but I'm going to lean into it. Right. So we leaned into it so hard that we moved from the Upper West Side to the South Bronx. We decided to be a part of the community that we were going to build a school around. I have no idea what this is all going to look like, but what I can tell you is everything that I was missing in my life as a person that worked in the financial industry, I received in spades in this startup education entity, right? We developed this extremely strong community of people, made up of the parents, the kids, the teachers, the community around this school over the course of 3 years. We built this unbelievable environment where suddenly, like, my life had purpose, right? My paycheck was way smaller, but my life had purpose. I knew that, like, no longer could I say, if I die tomorrow, did I make an impact? The teachers are the frontline folks, but I was a part of that, right? I was able to offer my skills to the benefit of other people, right? And not in like a money-making sense, but in like a foundational way, like education. Like we were there for 3 school years to help build up that school. And today, by the way, Berea College Prep is a network of many schools. It serves over 1,000 families in all over the Bronx. So it was a extremely formative professional experience for me. My second job allowed me to see and taste what it was, what it was like to devote yourself to work that's beyond you, bigger than you. And it was wildly fulfilling. Like it was incredibly fulfilling. And we're still very close to all of the lifelong friends that we've made there.
What is the next opportunity? I mean, it sounds like this was so fulfilling. How difficult was it leaving that opportunity as well?
It was extremely difficult. 2016, the year that we decided to leave, was probably the hardest year that we've had as a family, as a couple, personally. And that's because we were so fulfilled. We were so full of joy and purpose, and we would have never left. But again, curveballs get thrown your way, in particular when you're young and you haven't lived through all the seasons yet. We had our first daughter in New York, and that changes the calculus again, right? Suddenly we're doing a really cool thing, but raising a little girl by ourselves in New York when we both have gigantic families with 4 loving grandparents, all of whom want to get to know this little girl. And we are choosing to be in a city by ourselves when our respective families are in giant pods into other cities, right? So we're like, how long are we going to do this? I don't think we can be here forever, right? Both of us. Again, we were in agreement about that, but it was hard. It was really hard to detach from purpose, from purposeful work. We made a kind of a practical choice to come to Maryland. We thought for a summer. We thought we'd come for that summer break, figure out, maybe end up working in education in a charter school in DC or something. Definitely not, like, staying in Cordova, Maryland was not on my bingo card in 2016, but it was a really hard adjustment. I grew up in this town, but at this point I was really different, right? I was a very different person, having lived in New York for 9 years and gone through all these experiences and met all these different types of people. And then to come back to my town, which I felt was stuck in like 1957, was really tough. And then for my wife, who's from South Chicago, lived in New York, and now lives in rural Maryland, it was just a really, really tough adjustment. But we got through it. We started to find our purpose here as well.
And walk me through, one, what that purpose is, and then did you know what that was when you moved, or did you just move and say, we're going to figure whatever it is out?
Yeah, we said we're going to figure whatever it is out. And our thought in our head was, we're definitely not staying here. We're going to end up in DC because we're city people now, right? And we're going to work in the charter space because we're very employable in the charter school space. And there's like 1 billion charter schools in DC. Like, it was a clear, like a no-brainer. But what ended up happening was that after that summer, at the beginning of the next school year, Samantha decided to take like a part-time job in the local school district that I grew up in. Mind you, I hadn't been here 15 years or something, and I assumed it was just like it was when I was a kid. Remember, I told you I was like one of one, right, in my school system. So Sam shows up to work, and she comes home and says, so like half the kids are Latino. And I'm like, half? You mean like a handful? Or she's like, no, like half. I'm like, what? In Easton? And she goes, yeah. I didn't know anything about my hometown, right? I was a transplant, effectively. It turns out that the community that I left was wildly different now. And so that experience that I had as a one of one in the 90s and early 2000s, now suddenly hundreds, thousands of kids were having those same experiences, right? And when I say that, I'm talking now about the cultural experience of being a minority in rural Maryland. It's a tough one, right? It was very difficult back then. Being a Latino coming from a Spanish-speaking home where your parents don't speak very good English, your customs are totally different, your religion is different, all those othering things forced me to push away my identity. I tried to be as un-Latino as I possibly could. In the way I dress, in the way I talk. Gerson, not Gerson. I never in my life introduced myself as Gerson to anyone because that was too embarrassing. Because then I have to explain, That's the experience that I had as a kid. And when I came here, it took some months, right? Of figuring this out. But I'm like, the problem's not over. The othering of children of immigrants is not done with. I think it's actually more pervasive. This is also, by the way, 2016, 2017, 2018. And Sam, she's very like proudly Latina, where I did the things that like, let me wear the whitest possible outfit. Let me look as white as I humanly can. She's like, hooped earrings, pulled back hair, all the stuff, right? That, and not to like, objectify, but she didn't know how to be anything else, right? So she was like, walks into a room and people look at her like she's got 3 heads in Easton, Maryland, because they've never seen an adult like her, right? And so suddenly we're like, wait a minute. This isn't okay. Their identity isn't going to be shut off and pushed out by anybody, right? If we can help, if there's something that we can do by simply providing a little bit of representation in some capacity, whether you're a teacher in a classroom or you take a volunteer position at a mentoring organization, there's something about us that might be able to help the kids in my community who are having the same experiences that I did as a kid. So I think that's how our gears started to grind. And little by little, we decided, you know what? Maybe there's a place for us here. Maybe there's a purpose for us here in our hometown. And it's to provide a little bit of perspective, outside perspective, to pockets of the community, like the education space, like the youth development space, where the things that make us unique, right? Like being college educated, being kids of immigrants, being kids who have left and came back kind of thing, where that could be of value. So that's where we started to kind of bring together, at this point, a lot of years of experiences and try to apply them in our hometown rather than try to like fly away again.
As you're formulating this idea, do you have the thought process that you are going to start something yourself? What do you see this becoming at this time? And then what does it turn into?
Yes, I would say that our aspiration at the time, and by the way, I always say our because I do believe that Sam and I have the same values and mission in mind. What our jobs are might be different, but I think we want to see the same things in the world. So kind of we think of ourselves as a team in that regard. We had come off of an incredibly fulfilling, but not just fulfilling, an effective experience in the poorest school district in the nation, right? Those kids for 3 years had tested on, standardized tests, national standardized tests, and outperformed their district schools, other charter schools, and private schools in New York City. So to us, you can't tell us that poverty equates to bad academic outcomes, right? Or that lack of resources, broken windows in schools equate to bad academic outcomes. We had seen otherwise. So when we looked at our community, we said, what's our excuse? I'm sorry, we have the same exact $14,000 per kid. Why are we not excellent? Our aspiration at the time, what we thought might happen is that we might be able to start a charter school in our district, but it turns out that's politically impossible in Maryland for a myriad of reasons. So that was like a first fleeting thought. Then we said, look, Sam's an educator. She's going to go full time into into a classroom and teach in our local district and try to make an impact from within the walls of one single classroom, right? And for me, again, total chance that Sam brought me to an info session of an organization called Talbot Mentors, where the idea was you get paired with a young person in the community. You meet with them every week. You provide what's called informal mentorship, community-based mentorship to one kid, right? So it's the interesting circumstance about that is that on the way home from that info session, we got like a blast email from the organization saying that the executive director was about to leave. We talked about it with Sam that night, and I said, do you think I should throw my name in the hat? I've never led it. I've always been like a number 2 guy, right? I've never led an organization. I don't know if I'm qualified for it. I don't know what they're looking for, but should I throw my name in the hat? And long story short, I was selected to be its next executive director. So I got the opportunity to become an organizational leader and build a whole different set of skills that I didn't have before, which were around, management of people, right? And then the other thing, the much more important thing to me, I learned how to listen to communities that we're actually trying to serve and to, at least on a personal level, center them in the pursuit of solutions to problems, right? I started working at Talbot Mentors November of 2017, and I worked there for 4 years. So I left in December. But in those 4 years, I came in very googly-eyed and very like ideals driven, right? And very optimistic about what could be achieved at a systems level, right? Like we can change hearts and minds. But I came to realize the nonprofit space is, I mean, it's full of fantastic intent, right? The intention is always great, but the impact of our work is not often aligned with the intent that we originally had. And that's really hard to decipher and unpack. There's a lot to unpack there, and we can if you want to. But over the course of those 4 years, I had a fantastic experience. The best parts of my job were, number one, learning how to manage, but manage is the wrong word. I think to show respect and dignity and treat with dignity and respect the people who are in my care, meaning the employees who work there, the people whose livelihoods I was responsible for, right? And then the families, by extension, that we serve, with the case managers who know the families intimately, listening to them consistently, and then using my position of leadership to bring those voices to the tables where they're not invited. That's the lesson I think that I take away for the rest of my life, right? That all of us are invited to certain tables. You're invited to certain tables. I'm invited to certain tables where someone else is not, right? Someone with less advantage than I, luck, skill, whatever you want to call it. The reality is they're the ones suffering from the problem that you and I are sitting here discussing at the table. So rather, if I've not gone through that problem, I shouldn't be offering solutions to it. And unfortunately, I think in the nonprofit space, that's what happens much more often than not. We say we want to be youth-centered and blah, 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 but that's not at all what happens. We try, but it doesn't really happen. And so it was a phenomenally fulfilling experience, and one that was extremely, again, formative, right? As another 4 years of, I think, professional growth. I am acutely aware of some of the problems in the world, but that doesn't mean that I'm the most affected by those problems. And so my constant pursuit will be to give the platform and the power, not just the platform, but the power and the resources to the people who are suffering from the problem, so that they can come up with a solution that they buy into, rather than being like, here's my solution, adapt,
Moving forward over the next, 3 to 5 years, what are you most passionate about, and where do you think you want to make the most impact moving forward?
Over the past 4 years, Talbot Mentors, and I take responsibility, and I proudly so, for focusing the energy of Talbot Mentors on the issue of equity, as we call it, equity and inclusivity. And I know that's a buzzword, or it can be treated as a buzzword depending on who you are. Perhaps it makes sense to take a step back and describe to you. Talbot Mentors serves young people ages 6 all the way through college by providing them a variety of different types of mentoring services. Now, the facts of the matter are that the majority of children who are served by Talbot Mentors are predominantly Black, predominantly brown, and predominantly poor. The people who do the volunteering are predominantly wealthy, predominantly older, predominantly white. So we have two totally different types of experiences as we walk around the world, right? Meeting here, interacting, and every time we interact, we change each other, right? There's no such thing as like we come together, we share some of ourselves, and then we come away exactly the same. We change each other. The power dynamic, though, is completely imbalanced, right? Young people don't have power. In particular, young, poor, Black and brown people, right? Don't have power. And that's still not resolved through volunteer organizations, right? That core problem of imbalance of power is not resolved, as much as it saddens me to say. And you asked about the next 3 to 5 years. As I peel back more and more layers of that onion, why don't they have power? There can be a lot of answers to this, but mine, the one that I'm choosing to focus on, is the imbalance in financial inclusivity and financial power. I mean, look around you, the way that the world is organized. Those who have financial, beginning with stability, are able to make choices for themselves. The less financially stable you are, the less free choices you are able to make, because then you have to do things, right? Whether that's, well, you got to go to this school because it's free, or you got to take that job because you have no other choice. There's less and less choice the more financially unstable you are. And the thing that I've been spending a lot of time studying and learning is what's at the root of that financial imbalance. And so over the next 3 to 5 years, my values are the same. I still believe in a world that's more balanced than the one that we see today, right? Where, as an example, my family, I have 70 family members in this in this county. Do you know how many of them are small business owners? 2, my dad and now me. The rest of us are worker bees because we have no choice, right, in the matter. And it's not because, I don't mean at the political level. Of course you can go and sign up and, get an EIN. It's not that. It's the financial ability to do it, right, and the system on which all of it is based. So my focus over the next 3 to 5 years, and I think I like that time frame, is to, first of all, continue to educate, myself, and then try to begin to share some of that knowledge and experience with other folks who are historically, for lack of a better term, oppressed, right? Such that we don't have to live in a world that needs more and more charity, but rather has more and more financial balance. I guess it's another method through which to address the same values that I've developed over the years, starting at Bria, right? Looking at watching these young kids that are stuck in the South Bronx. They are utterly trapped in the South Bronx through no fault of their own. Nothing to do with their willingness to work hard, their willingness to, or their desires for something better, but they're stuck. They have no choices, right? Here in Easton, same thing. There's not a single food establishment owned by a Black person. I can't get food that might come from a Black person's culture in my community. And that's not because the laws there's nothing illegal about it, right? It's perfectly legal to do so. There's just no financial ability to. And I believe that in the absence of that diversity in our society, we all suffer. A community that doesn't have a variety of culinary cultural experiences is devoid of something, right? Is devoid of those experiences. And then extrapolate that out to the arts, right? At the root of all of these things is financial, what I think of as exclusivity, right? Exclusion of people from the financial system. I know a lot of them, right?
To end it, I always like asking, what is something that you would want to tell them or you wish you knew going back kind of before you quit that first job?
And this is coming from, I guess, a person who's risk tolerant. Work is us renting out our time to someone else, right? The paycheck that you get every 2 weeks is literal. It's the monetary representation of the last 40 hours, 80 hours of your time. And so value your time over everything else, right? The paycheck may be large, but it costs you your time. So I'm 37 and I have a 2-year-old and a 6-year-old. And this is the time where I need to be here, changing diapers, going to play stuff, because their life is going to move on. They're going to have sports and social stuff. And what do I want my time for when I'm 60 and they're 20? I want it now. So value your time and then structure your life such that you can do that, right? Don't be short-sighted and what we call high time preference, right? It's like, I want the thing now, right? And it's hard because that's what we're sold all the time. That's what we're told. Don't get the thing now. Set up your life such that you can buy back your time and spend it how you actually want, so that you don't have to wait 40 years for, quote, retirement, which is simply an admission that you weren't doing what you wanted to for the last 40 years anyway.
Amazing to hear, and I really appreciate your time and you sharing that story.
Thank you, Dave. Thank you. I really enjoyed this time as well.
Thank you for listening. It really means a lot to us. We want to hear from you as we keep growing. Please reach out on whyquit.co if you have any feedback or potential guests. A special thanks to Chris Dole for the music. Please check out his newest album, Here's to You, on Spotify. Thank you, and we will be back next week with another episode.